There was a good reason for this strict regime. It was to make the boys Christian gentlemen, manly and enlightened, finer specimens of human nature than any other country could furnish. The words of rugby's celebrated headmaster, Thomas Arnold. This is the room known as Upper Bench, where Dr. Arnold taught some of the sons of the wealthier Victorian middle class. But from what they were taught, you would never guess that Victorian scientists, engineers, architects and explorers were about to forge the modern world. It was rather the ancient Romans who provided the model. Victorian headmasters and politicians didn't look forward, but back to the classical world in which civilization was spread at the point of the sword. This is a timetable from 1899, and it shows that if you were a 16-year-old in the upper middle part of the school, this would be what you'd study. Divinity, classics, 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 maths, natural science, classics, maths, classics, 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 French, history, French, maths, classics, 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 maths, classics. Small wonder that as one visitor to another public school remarked, not one boy in 10 could tell him where Birmingham was. But a public school education wasn't really about learning where Birmingham was. A particular idea of Christian values, discipline, respect for rules and ritual, these made up the public school's true mission, the moulding of character. But there was something else fostered here that would prove an even more powerful builder of empire. The British public school practiced two religions, Christianity and sport. According to one Victorian headmaster, sport was the rock on which Britain's greatness was built.
Englishmen, he said, are not superior to Frenchmen or Germans in brains or industry, or the science or applications of war. In the history of the British Empire, it is written that England owes her sovereignty to her sports.
The values of organized games were said to express the values of empire. Physical courage, team spirit, and having a go.
And it was the game of cricket which gave rise to one of the most famous of all famous empire poems. There's a breathless hush in the close tonight, 10 to make and the match to win, a bumping pitch and a blinding light, an hour to play and the last man in. And it's not for the sake of a ribboned coat or the selfish hope of a season's fame, but his captain's hand on his shoulder smote. Play up, and play the game. In the poem, the scene shifts from the cricket field to a bloody battle in the African desert. The schoolboy is now a soldier, his comrades in arms dead or dying all around him. But then his spirits soar as he hears his captain's voice calling, play up, and play the game." It's majestic and it's idiotic at the same time, to our eyes at least, because war isn't a game. And yet the fact that the poem could be written in that way tells us something rather profound about the way that the British viewed their empire. The battle which had inspired the poem was fought by British troops in the biggest country in Africa, Sudan. In such remote outposts, the heroes of empire achieved sometimes mythical status. In 1884, the Empire found a hero who played the game with a passion that bordered on madness. He was a soldier who showed that heroic failure could be even more inspiring than victory. Charles Gordon was a maverick, a general who disobeyed orders and wrote his own. He became an imperial martyr in one of the strangest episodes in the history of empire, the Siege of Khartoum. The capital was surrounded by thousands of Islamic warriors, followers of a religious leader sworn to end British rule. He called himself the Mahdi, the expected one. The man sent from Britain to stop the Mahdi, roared on by the London newspapers, was already a legendary soldier and a fervent Christian. General Charles George Gordon was an extraordinary man. He was thin, he was 51, he was unmarried, and he had blue eyes with a faraway look in them. Other places they'd just have called him a crank, but as it was, the British public, whipped up by the press, came to share his unshakable self-belief. General Gordon could save Khartoum. Gordon's orders weren't to fight, but to evacuate the British force there. But Gordon himself had something rather more heroic in mind. From the governor's palace, he announced he'd hold out against the Mahdi until reinforcements were sent. The siege of the city began. The British government, furious with Gordon's disobedience, refused to act. The press were outraged at this treatment of their hero. Gordon had been deserted, they cried. He must be rescued. General Gordon was a hero, not just because he was a remarkable human being, but because he seemed to express Britain's moral purpose. The newspapers twigged that in a way that the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, didn't. Gladstone didn't want a war, but the press and public opinion forced his hand. The army hastily assembled a relief force, but by now it was too late. After 10 months under siege, every scrap of food in Khartoum had been eaten. The dead lay in the streets. The Mahdi's men were at the gates. The water level of the Nile protecting the city dropped further every day. Holed up in the governor's palace, Gordon was relishing the part he'd given himself in this imperial tragedy. He lit candles in his rooms, almost offering himself as a target to the Mahdi's snipers. A companion begged him to stop.
When God was portioning out fear to the people of the world, he told him, "At last it came to my turn, and there was no fear left to give me. Go tell all the people of Khartoum that Gordon fears nothing, because God has created him without fear."
When the attack came, it was unbelievably savage. The siege had lasted 317 days. It ended in a bloodbath. Gordon was killed in the battle. The Mahdi's followers brought him Gordon's head as a trophy. The general's body was never found. Khartoum and the Sudan belonged to the Mahdi. The Mahdi's great-grandson still lives in the city. Ah, good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, Imam. Good morning. Thank you for having us. What sort of a man was your great-grandfather?
The Mahdi was a world-denying figure. Although he wanted to change the world, he really wanted to change it in favor of the next world. So actually he was a world-denying, almost the aspirations of a mystic. Whatever kingdom he had in mind is a kingdom in heaven, not here.
When you think about it, they're really pretty similar individuals, aren't they? I mean, they're both religious. They were both ascetic men. They both.
Yes.
Gordon too was a man who mortified the flesh and
Indeed.
denied the world.
Indeed.
And he was a great hero in Britain in the way that the Mahdi was a popular hero here.
Indeed. That's why there is this tragedy, that there was this conflict between people who, in a world differently organized, could have been very close friends.
What do you feel about General Gordon?
He had no business combating people who were asserting themselves. The whole basis is that power corrupts. And if you have power, it's very difficult for you to accept other human beings as your equal, because you feel that the very powerful situation makes you some kind of god. Then you make the rules, then you make the everything, you decide everything. And this, of course, is a great human failing.
If General Gordon had only done as he was told and evacuated Khartoum, he'd never have become the imperial hero he immediately turned into, even though he'd have saved thousands of lives, his own included. The people of Britain didn't much care whether or not Sudan was in the British Empire, but this wasn't about a place. It was about an idea.